Hello, friends. Welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is a continuation of our series on the book of Romans. And this Before You Read lecture is on Romans chapters 9 through 11. I think the first thing that is worth saying is that these chapters are meant to be read together. All three chapters are meant to be read together. Probably more so than even maybe chapters 4 through 8 are meant to be read together. And so it's vital that we try to understand what Paul is doing in chapters 9 through 11 and follow the argument through these three chapters. The other thing that's worth saying at the beginning is that these chapters are not merely a second thought. They're not sort of fanciful reflection. They are not ancillary to Paul's broader theological argument in Romans. Rather, one could say that they really get to the heart of his argument, or at least to the implications of his argument related to how God goes about making humanity right, how God goes about rectifying and restoring and redeeming humanity, the means by which he does so, the grounds by which God does so, and so forth. Chapters 9 through 11 are not a second thought to that central argument. Instead, they are a part and parcel to that broader argument. As you read these three chapters, Romans 9 through 11, I want you to keep two presenting problems in mind and one deeper problem in mind. So the first presenting problem is the apparent rejection of the gospel, or Paul's articulation of the gospel, by the majority of his fellow Israelite co-religionists. So he'll, in some places, call them Jews in Romans. Sometimes he'll refer to them as Israelites. But it's okay for us to say that Paul has experienced that the gospel that he's proclaiming has not been well received among his Jewish compatriots. He identifies himself as an apostle to the Gentiles, but he's also aware, and he speaks of this in some of his other letters, that he has experienced hardship or rejection or pushback from his Jewish co-religionists, his Jewish brothers and sisters, if you will. So the first problem, the first presenting problem that Paul is wrestling with in chapters 9 through 11 is the apparent Jewish rejection of the gospel, or of his gospel as he's articulated it. The second presenting problem, and Paul speaks directly to this in chapter 11, is the problem of Gentile boasting or Gentile pride. So the other side of that first problem is that the Gentiles, whether they're God-fearers or otherwise engaged with the larger Jewish community, these Gentiles have been very receptive to the gospel that Paul has provided. They have, he identifies himself as sent to this people, and they've been receptive. Not, again, across the board. We know of other letters, and we know from Acts that the non-Jewish people could also be resistant to the message that Paul was proclaiming. And so, but in general, there is this Gentile acceptance with that. And what Paul is wrestling with is a subtle, or perhaps a not so subtle, sense among some of those Gentiles that since they have accepted the gospel as Paul has articulated it, they have somehow come to replace or take the place of Israel. So Paul is dealing with this probably under the surface pride or boasting among his Gentile audience that says, you know what, we have made the right decision. We did the right thing. We said yes to that gospel, unlike those other foolish, irreligious people. And so Paul is also trying to balance that and trying to put that into the right perspective. So those are the two, I would say, presenting issues in Romans 9 through 11. Jewish rejection of the gospel and the potential for Gentile boasting or pride in their reception of the gospel. But I would say that the deeper problem that Paul is wrestling with, the theological heart of the problem that Paul is wrestling with, is this question: is God ultimately trustworthy? Is God trustworthy? Can the Gentiles, can the Jews, can people, all of humanity, trust God? To be faithful to God's purposes, to be faithful to God's promises, to be faithful in mercy, to be faithful in judgment, to be faithful in love and grace and all of those other things. Is God trustworthy? I think as you follow the thread of Paul's argument in Romans 9 through 11, one of the things that he wants to really affirm is that God is trustworthy. God doesn't just change God's mind flippantly. Instead, God is bound to God's promises. God is bound to God's purposes. And so if Paul was to say in Romans 9 through 11, you know what, the Jewish people, the Israelites have rejected God, therefore it would make sense that God has rejected them. If he was to say that, he would have very little room to encourage Gentile believers or Jewish believers that God will continue to be faithful to them. Because if God so quickly rejects God's historical covenants and promises to the people of Israel, then what's to say that in 100 years or in 2,000 years, God is not going to do the same to those who have been engrafted into the covenant through the actions of Christ? And so ultimately, chapters 9 through 11 are all about the trustworthiness of God. Is God someone in whom we can trust? As with the other parts of Romans, I think this is another section where paying attention to Paul's questions, his rhetorical questions, is an important way for us to track and trace the argument. And there are a number of rhetorical questions in this section of Paul's letter, but I would highlight just a few places where you really might want to sort of zero in on the question and zero in on both what has preceded it and what maybe is causing Paul to ask this question, and then pay attention also to how Paul answers his own question. And so the first question comes in 9:14, and it is this: is there then injustice on God's part? Is God unjust, in other words? And Paul will go on to explain it's not a question of justice, but it's a question of God's mercy. And then he has another question in 9:19. Why then does God find fault? If it's all up to God's merciful choice, then do humans have accountability at all, right? So moving the question again of God's trustworthiness and how that relates to a human response. Then in 11:1, Paul asks a deeply significant question. Has God rejected God's people? Has God rejected God's people? And then finally, in 11:11, he asked the question whether or not the Israelite people have stumbled so as to fall, I would add, permanently or eternally. So he's really wrestling in these last two questions with the position or the long-term destination of the people of Israel. And so pay attention to these four questions, to how they relate to the material that has preceded them, and how Paul answers them in the immediate context. I think I want to say just two more things about these chapters. The first is pay attention to, I would say, how Paul's thinking is almost in development. I've talked about this before, but if we imagine Paul as having this well-formulated theological vision in his mind that he simply vomits out into paper, that results in a different level of engagement with his writing than if we think about Paul as more of a conversationalist, more of someone who's working out his thinking as he writes or as he discusses with his secretary or with Phoebe, who's in the room with him, or anyone else. And so maybe I invite you to read this section as if Paul is thinking his way. He's writing his way into thought. He is actively reflecting, and that may explain why some of his argument seems to sort of circle or double back. So imagine it like that. And then I think the last thing to pay attention to is pay attention to the tone of how chapter 11 ends. Pay attention to the sorts of things Paul affirms at the end of this section, the sorts of things he encourages or commands his audience to do or to think or to receive. And how does that shed light? How does that ending shed light on all that has preceded it? Well, friends, Romans 9 through 11 is a very important passage in this very important writing. It will require our attention, and I'm sure it will generate lots of discussion. I'm looking forward to our conversations. Happy reading.